This is episode 9 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast. We're going to go toward a different direction today. In the past, I've discussed parallel government, managing the old regime after you win. I've discussed multi-party socialism, which is what I'm fighting for. Discussed how life is a role-playing game, and so is this podcast, and so is revolution and parallel government, everything. However, one thing I haven't discussed is strategy. Here, by strategy, you could say parallel government is a central part of the strategy. But to sum up what I'm really advocating here, it's a combination of 4 things. First, you have to form a parallel government, even if you have to form it on the basis of a small number of people. The second, that parallel government should uphold a political goal of multi-party socialism. Third, the parallel government should hold anti-government protests, or protests which don't revolve primarily around reform demands, but whose primary demand is that the current government resign or be removed or abdicate, and another government be installed. A famous Arabic slogan during the Egyptian Revolution was, "The people demand removal of the regime." People in Iran have recently been demanding the removal of the regime. It's a thing that happens, in 1989, the anti-communist revolutions, they demanded the removal of regimes. It's a thing that happens throughout history. It's a thing that happens in crowd revolutions. You can't get what you want unless you articulate it. And, people say, oh, we're just trapped in demanding concrete reforms. But a lot of those concrete reforms don't ever get granted. The system doesn't cave. How long have we been demanding universal health care? 30 years now, since 1993? Well, it's 2023. Then they'll grant some demands, but they're not very effective. They're counteracted by other systemic pressures. They grant some demands, but they're counteracted by either being reversed by later legislative action or by being neutralized with caveats, with loopholes in the laws. So the first 3 things: 1, parallel government; 2, it's for multi-party socialism and limits its membership to people who support that; and 3, anti-government protests, or protests demanding the removal of the current government, including current legislature. Sometimes these are targeted at dictators, sometimes these are targeted at legislatures. Then finally 4, and this is really the heart of the strategy, because whether you look at classic revolutions like the French or Russian Revolution, or you look at more recent revolutions like the color revolutions or the Arab Spring, a key part of all of them is that there is a struggle by the public to achieve a realignment of the state, which is different from the government. The state is the typically unelected bureaucracy, such as administration like Ministry of Labor in Britain or Department of Labor in the United States, EPA, all these state departments, government departments, rather I should say state departments, to achieve a realignment of them from the old ruling government to the people in revolution and to the new government that the people are putting forward. It is very frequent throughout revolutions that mass protests will cause the police and army, who are called on the protesters, to fail to perform their duties of repression, in many cases even realigning themselves to side with the protesters. So, in Gene Sharp and his theories, Gene Sharp is this famous theorist of nonviolent crowd revolutions, whose work significantly influenced the Occupy Wall Street movement, as well as the battle in Seattle of 1999 and the World Trade Organization protests. He also significantly influenced the Arab Spring, which preceded Occupy Wall Street. And then he has a co-theorist named Robert Helvey, who writes a lot more about this issue of pillars of support. Pillars of support can include community organizations like the church or the media, but it also includes institutions of state. Whatever support is holding up the old regime. You can flip these things. You can cause a defection, realignment, mutiny, or non-performance of repressive duties. Now, the point is not to, do some James Bond infiltration of these things. Instead, it's to create such demand and support by the people that the demonstrations of the people demanding removal of a regime, demanding systemic change, cause the security forces to begin to disintegrate in their loyalty to the old system and maybe join forces with the new system. For example, many of the people who participated in the October Revolution of 1917 in Russia, people say, oh, you gotta, you can't work with the security forces of, the state you're fighting against. Well, a lot of the people who participated in the October Revolution were soldiers of the government who decided to support a revolution against the government that had organized them into military units. Entire units would go over, not just individual soldiers, though some of them as well. Sailors. During the recent Ukrainian revolutions, the police just decided not to enforce against the protesters at a certain point. Let me see if I can find anything about Egypt specifically. Okay, let me just go right to this list of examples of pillars flipping. So in the Egyptian Revolution on January 30th, 2011, the army was ordered to use live ammunition to suppress protesters, but refused. In the Ukraine 2014 revolution, the police abandoned the central government buildings, allowing protesters to take over. In the English Revolution, the Revolutionary Army removed royalist sympathizers from Parliament, which was an act against Parliament in a certain sense, even though formally those soldiers were serving Parliament against the king. In the French Revolution, there was the coup of 1793, in which National Guard soldiers sided with the Jacobins and the insurgent Paris Commune, which is their word for city council, not like a hippie commune. And they entered the National Convention, which was the national legislature, and they removed royalist sympathizers and various corrupt representatives from it, which was an act against the legislature that they formally would be thought of as serving. Again, during the Russian Revolution, the army in mutiny joined with rebelling workers to overthrow the unpopular provisional government in favor of workers' councils in 1917. In the German Revolution, Navy sailors turned whole ships against the German regime. In the Vietnam War, American soldiers refused to fight and also killed their officers. In the Philippines People Power Revolution of 1986, army units joined the revolution, and even an attack helicopter unit joined the protests. In the Serbian Revolution of 2000, police refused to protect the parliament building as protesters stormed it. So we've got a number of examples, including Egypt, which Mike McNair in various podcasts has claimed, it never came to the point of the Egyptian troops refusing orders, but they actually did on January 30th, 2011. Nanny Nunu. Anyway, back to the top. The strategy involves parallel governments supporting a political position of multi-party socialism brought to power through anti-government protests, including labor strikes, or protests which demand the removal of a government rather than primarily reform demands, which generate popular pressure to cause defections in the state bureaucracy and security forces from the old ruling government to the new parallel government formed by the revolutionary movement. In biological cell division, a cell forms two different nuclei, which then pull the chromosomes and the cell apart. A similar thing happens in revolutions. The competing nuclei are competing governments, or in the absence of a parallel government, simply the conflict between the protesting crowd as one center of gravity versus the ruling government as the other center of gravity. The chromosomes are the departments of state administration and units of security forces being tugged in opposite directions by competing priorities of loyalty to the old system versus sympathy for the new revolution. The plasma of the cell, also dividing, is like the population itself, divided between the revolution and the ruling government. Each state employee, officer, and soldier is forced to decide, will they defend the current laws or respect the right of the people to control society? This is not a pinch most people want to be in. Now, this Gene Sharpian theory involves something called the backfire effect, which is when you engage in nonviolent protest and the security forces attack you. Hopefully non-lethally, but it happens. And what this does is it actually expands sympathy for your movement in the public. So, on the face of it, nonviolent action might seem counterintuitive because you might be thinking, well, don't we have to push the old system out of the way somehow, physically? Using pushing, shoving, shooting. But the truth is, you actually do more to get the public on your side and disintegrate the discipline of the security forces by maintaining nonviolent discipline, and that's a very important term that we all have to chant like a mantra, nonviolent discipline, over and over. Now, it's also true that you can use this idea of pillars of support, flipping the pillars, disintegrating the discipline of the security forces, realigning the security forces to your side. You can do this and still actually involve some kind of violent or military struggle. For example, in the Russian Revolution, it wasn't like they were using Gene Sharp's nonviolent strategy. They did flip the pillars, they did get a realignment of security forces, and then they used those security forces in an insurrection, a violent military insurrection. It wasn't too bad of a battle, but it still, shots were fired. So you can do it either way, and I guess I'm just arguing that in modern countries where the weapons are far more destructive than they used to be, it's good to lean into this concept of nonviolent discipline and realigning the security forces through the backfire effect of nonviolent action, and suffering and enduring repression, and garnering sympathy through it. Is it a universal rule? Maybe not. Maybe there are particularly repressive dictatorships. And there's also a distinction between the glorified, stereotypical, romanticized concept of revolution as a military struggle involving firearms versus the reality of revolution, which is often riots. It's not the people rising up violently with guns, it's people rising up violently with pushing and shoving and punching and sticks and rioting. So it's possible to have a crowd revolution that is violent but non-military. It's also possible to have a non-violent crowd revolution. These are all options we should all keep in mind. I am tend toward nonviolence. I think it makes the most strategic sense in the modern world. For example, I'm not sure Hamas is accomplishing very much for the people of Palestine right now. But, in the backfire effect, their small rocket attack has caused such an overreaction that the global population is rallying to Palestine. So the backfire effect can work from, sort of guerrilla warfare, military action. But the point is the form of resistance that the world is coming to around Palestine is pretty much the nonviolent form of protest and boycott divestment actions. It's not absolute. I'll go more into nonviolence maybe in another chapter. So what is needed is a change of government, the removal of one government and the installation of another. And to accomplish this, we will need protests, marches, and rallies demanding this, because this is precisely how a thing has historically and even recently occurred. Yes, this is a highly advanced position, and will bring you into dramatic conflict with others who would prefer to hold marches and demonstrations around reform demands. This is simply a debate that has to be repetitively had out, sustained by theoretical works, discussion groups, and organizations which support this position. I have all these diagrams in my notes of cell division to illustrate the point I'm making. So you get regime change by demanding it. You should probably build a revolutionary movement organization. Again, this is an organization more of protesters than of soldiers. You use it to hold street actions that demand the removal of the current government. To build support, you could do surrealist happenings, just silly apolitical street happenings as a form of outreach. Never explain anything to anyone, just keep looping people in. Street actions can also proclaim support for a new revolutionary government. The change of government usually does not occur, at least in many revolutions, until after a parallel government is already formed, while the old government is still standing. So instead of immediately trying to disband the old government without having a new one formed, it makes more sense to form a new one and then build up protest while the new one is there, and build the protest up to the point where disbanding the old government is possible. And I'll have episodes about how that works. So mass protest convinces government agencies to defect from the current ruling legislature to the revolution. I mean, in many ways, the USA is already kind of at a stage of mass protest, but we don't have a parallel government, and we don't have a demand that the government be removed in the name of a socialist government. I mean, the people demanding the removal of the government are the reactionaries, the Trump supporters. So protest becomes massive when a revolutionary government emerges. So it might make sense to shift the focus from being anti-Trump or identity politics to economic transformation, democratic socialism. Hold street actions which primarily demand regime change instead of reform. Okay, I'm going to read an excerpt or a few quotes from the book Coup d'etat, A Practical Handbook. Yeah, Edward Lutwak wrote this devilish book, which I read in my garage under rather unfortunate personal circumstances. Coup d'etat, A Practical Handbook. I have 2 copies of it. One got ruined by the rain. That's the one I'm looking at right now. Completely devilish book. Very sarcastic. Very funny. So here's some quotes from Edward Lutwak's Coup d'etat, A Practical Handbook. As a direct consequence of its sheer size, in order to achieve even a minimum of efficiency, the state bureaucracy has to divide its work into clear-cut areas of competence, which are assigned to different departments. Within each department, there must be an accepted chain of command, and standard procedures have to be followed. Thus, a given piece of information or a given order is followed up in a stereotyped manner, or like a photocopied manner. And if the order comes from the appropriate source at the appropriate level, it is carried out. In the more critical parts of the state apparatus, the armed forces, the police, and the security services, all of these characteristics are intensified with a greater degree of discipline and rigidity. The apparatus of the state is therefore, to some extent, a machine that will normally behave in a fairly predictable and automatic manner. He's saying that, like, the state is machinery, that the people in the state kind of behave in a robot-like manner because they have to behave according to routines and chains of command. So then he says, a coup operates by taking advantage of this machine-like behavior, both during and after the takeover. During the coup, because it uses part of the state apparatus to seize the controlling levers over the rest, and afterward, because the value of the levers depends on the degree to which the state really functions as a machine. So the way it works is, if you get some of the state to begin siding with the revolutionary government, like, one can start an avalanche, one can start a domino effect, because governments know and state departments know that it's not stable to have a divided state, and the state better get on one side or the other, or things are going to break down, society could collapse. So coup d'etats are less democratic than crowd revolutions, but they work a similar way in which they get parts of the state, not every department, not every military unit, but just some of them, to declare and act in favor of the revolution or the regime change, the transition. And then either through force or just sort of self-preservation instinct, or just the desire for a cohesive state, the rest of the state gets on board, because they are people who are not, activists or vigilantes. They think of themselves as workers who do their job. The goal of regime change is to persuade and pressure the pillars of state to realign from the old regime to the revolution, securing their wholesale realignments as entire agencies. When an individual from the pillars interacts with us, we don't tell them to go sabotage their workplace. We tell them to tell everyone at work about our cause. We tell them why we're protesting. We tell them to participate in the protests if and when they can. We tell them to support the protests and encourage everyone at work also to support the protests. This is how you go from powerless to sovereign. So during a coup d'etat, intelligence agencies will infiltrate the pillars, which is not what I'm recommending. And crowds attempt to win the support of the pillars through persuasion and pressure of mass protest. It's a bit different. So there's a term called détournement. It's a term of the Situationists. The Situationists were a political and art movement that was active in France in the 1960s and was extremely influential subsequently on the punk rock movement. And it had a lot of, its founder was a former Trotskyist, but it went in the direction of anarchism. And it also went in this direction of, like, being anti-ideology, just saying, don't think, just act, just explode, just use creative art to subvert the system, use pop cultures to subvert the system. But also, they were very much in favor of the sort of spontaneous mass protests which took place in Paris in May of 1968. A lot of situationist graffiti and slogans were popular during those protests, and that involved workers' councils, and it could have been a revolution. Anyway, they have this concept of détournement, where you sort of take something and repurpose it, you hijack it. For example, the Adbusters flag takes the American flag, but instead of stars, it's got a bunch of corporate logos. That's an example of détournement. But there are other examples. And you can also say that you can engage in institutional détournement, where, for example, in the English Civil War, Parliament was summoned by the king, but then turned against the king. I mean, there are many examples of this, like the Third Estate was summoned by the King of France, but then became the National Assembly and revolted against the King of France. And there's lots of examples, like social media was started by capitalism, but now it's used by protesters. Things like that. The working class itself was created by capitalism for profit, but then becomes the main engine of destruction of capitalism. So, in a similar sense, flipping the pillars, getting the state agencies and security forces to realign from the old system to the revolution, to the new government, is another example of sort of situationist détournement. And you notice this is a funny pronunciation I'm making. I could just say détournement. That would be the English way, but this is French terminology, so I'm saying détournement. I'm probably not even pronouncing it correctly. So I'm just reading my notes now. So there's a theorist named Nikos Poulantzas, and he was one who argued that socialism will come about through a conflict within the state instead of just a conflict coming from outside the state against the state. And in reality, what he's talking about is very similar to what happens during the sort of Gene Sharp concept of a color revolution or crowd revolution. It's very similar to actually what did happen in Russia. A lot of people think, oh, they smashed the state because that's what Lenin said in State and Revolution. Well, look at what they did. What they did was they realigned the security forces and then took over the still existing bureaucracies. They did not actually smash the state. They smashed it into a new alignment. They did not smash it out of existence. The anarchists want to smash it out of existence. And I don't think that's even desirable. I think that would just cause like a mess, social collapse, which disintegrates society and kills off 90% of the population in an apocalypse. I don't think that's desirable. Ted Kaczynski can go away as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so Nikos Poulantzas talks about a conflict within the state. So the mechanisms he's talking about are common to crowd revolutions, but also coups d'etats, which crowd revolutions and coups d'etats also have an overlap in that they both realign the security forces. They both realign the agencies of state. They just use different mechanisms to do so. You could say that they're the same thing. A lot of people would bristle at that. There are some people who are very proud of being, nonviolent, democratic crowd revolution organizers. People from those international organizations who give people nonviolence trainings in other countries to overthrow dictatorships, they would say, we are not doing coups d'etats. We are doing popular revolutions, crowd revolutions. I can understand because coups d'etats sound undemocratic, but there have been coups d'etats which brought about better systems. Revolutionary coups d'etats. You could say the October Revolution was a revolutionary coup d'etat. So you either use forces within the state to seize power within the state by their own will, which is often a coup d'etat, or forces within the state seize power under pressure from mass protest and share power in some kind of new democratic system, a crowd revolution. The mechanism that pushes things over the edge is the way mass protest combined with a demand for regime change incites the realignment of the pillars. The idea is not to get enough people together to crush the government. That's no longer even physically possible in developed countries due to the technology at the disposal of the security forces. Instead, the idea is to get enough people together that part of the state volunteers to overthrow the rest of the state or stands aside and lets the people do it. So, as Mike McNair's pointed out in Revolutionary Strategy, it's not so much physical force, but political authority that's the decisive factor in revolutions. So there was a Chapo episode where Slavoj Žižek made an appearance called Heaven Out of Order. And at 1 hour, 1 minute, 16 seconds, he said, don't wait for the right moment. The right moment arises only through failed attempts. And this is why I support starting a parallel government now, starting anti-government protests now, even if they're small, isolated, and they have to initially disguise themselves as artistic, surrealist happenings for fun. I mean, I feel like doing those things anyway. Balance realistic patience and realistically necessary urgency. In the same episode on Chapo, Žižek said, at minute 103, 30 seconds, he said, the spontaneous tendency is towards suicide. Voluntarism is what we need today, doing things that are not grounded in any deeper historical law. So voluntarism is when you do things that seem premature. And I agree with Žižek, is that the prematurity is over. The world is dying. It's time for a qualitative escalation of resistance. And even resistance is not quite enough. It's time for a qualitative escalation toward revolution. Because resistance is like when you just fight against what is instead of finding a way to replace it. Right, so I'm just reading my notes. I'm not really sure what this is going to say, what this means. A critique of the left, common to both Leninism and the Situationists, is that if you're someone who believes you have to wait for the revolution, and that you have to wait for material conditions to be ready, you are in practice no different than a reformist, which is in practice no different than a liberal. The revolution is something you have to make happen, and the only material conditions slowing you down are just the realities of organizing. However, no one anymore even knows that revolutionary organizing equals concrete preparations for regime change. People think, oh, revolutionary organizing just means engaging in reform struggles and raising the slogan of revolution within the coalitions and participants of those struggles. While all organizing builds up our forces to carry out a regime change, Lenin exhorted his readers to study the art of insurrection. So the modern art of regime change doesn't rely primarily on firearms, though it could. And neither did the Russian Revolution, though it did make use of them secondarily. If the point is to take state power, regime change can be imagined more as a heist than a confrontation. Like Robin Hood, we intend to steal state power from the rich and give it to the people. Rather than abstract, regime change is always the most concrete demand. In practice, virtually none of our demands will be met by reform struggles. If redistribution is the most concrete issue, and it can only be achieved by regime change, then regime change is the most concrete struggle there is. So what does it mean to do concrete preparations for regime change in the year 2023 and moving forward, since this year is almost over? It means building a parallel government, organizing anti-government protests, building like a network socially through, fun events to keep this sort of party going. A lot of educational work to repetitively explain to people you meet, the public, as well as your own participants and members, why it makes sense to do this, why it makes sense to start small and build larger. Why does it make sense to do something that people don't really understand? Why does it make sense to drop reform demands and insist that they be replaced by a demand for regime change? We're going to have to repeatedly explain this to people. We're going to have to almost be like a choir or a band that practices the talking points of why this makes sense and rehearses them and repeats them continually. Some of this work might happen through publications or podcasts. Some of this work might occur just through discussion groups or meetings with a speaker who explains the concepts. A new revolutionary strategy probably requires a new organization, because if you go into other organizations advocating this, they're not going to be on board. They're stuck in their strategies. Organizations tend not to change just because someone at the bottom tries to agitate for change. They tend to be entrenched in the way they do things. Sometimes the leadership may decide to make changes beyond what, but it's usually not membership input. And often when organizations make changes, they're changes in negative directions imposed upon them by popular pressure, but that popular pressure isn't progressive. It represents the false consciousness of the majority brainwashed under capitalism. False consciousness takes many forms. False consciousness is just people believing in capitalism when it's against their own personal interest to do so. That's false consciousness. It's the constant media brainwashing, just the material environment of artificial scarcity we're in that convinces us that capitalism is somehow necessary or unavoidable, when in reality it's not. But it manifests so many different ways. I would say reformism. Okay, so in the movement against capitalism, there's a lot of false consciousness too, except instead of it being about these social issues, it's false consciousness around strategic issues. Like, people think we can just reform our way out of the system. We can't. That's false consciousness within the movement. I would contend that a lot of identity politics is also false consciousness within the movement, but it's imposed upon the movement by the larger media environment in which the movement is operating. And that's why you have the majority of the anarchist movement, the socialist movement, supporting positions that are actually pretty counterproductive to its own goal of overthrowing capitalism. So, the demand for regime change is targeted at three groups. One is the public, who we want to join our protests. The other is the pillars of state, who we want to defect to our side. And finally is the ruling government, or ruling class, or both, who we would like to see resign or abdicate, or at least cease to resist disbandment and replacement. So this propaganda of supporting regime change, calling for the removal of the government, works at multiple levels and interacts with different layers of the population in different ways. Sometimes I say edgy things. I'm going to continue doing that. I'm just reading my notes. This podcast, for those who are just catching up now, this podcast is me trying to write a book, but the notes are all scrambled because I wrote it in stream of consciousness to make sure I would get all the concepts down. And now I'm reading it to myself so I can process it all and try to put it in a more coherent form. But in the meantime, I think it's urgent enough to try to get it out to the public immediately, even in its sort of disorganized form. So I am just reading my notes into a recording device and uploading them as podcast episodes. In a certain sense, the anarchists who go out into the streets and break stuff are definitely the most inspiring section of the population. On the other hand, the anarcho-punk riot scene constitutes just another dead end of its own, like elections or union organizing without a revolutionary game plan. People gravitate toward destructive behavior not only because they wrongly believe this is an effective strategy alone, but also as a way of avoiding the hard thinking about strategic questions, including the very strategic question over whether destructive action makes any sense. Sometimes people do things to avoid questioning what they're doing. It's an odd form of repression, to double down on what you're doing to avoid thinking about whether what you're doing makes sense. We see this with concentration camp guards. Now, that's a very different category, but it's a similar psychology. The strategy of modern regime change, whether coup d'etat or crowd rebellion, is called flipping the pillars. All power is based on cooperation, but cooperation by pillars of state, like the military, police, state bureaucracy, and media, give a regime greater power than mere popular support. So these institutions are more central to holding up a system than the general public. The general public can just kind of be ignored by the system. Not entirely, but to a great extent. If these institutions flip, though, then the regime is in immediate trouble. Now, interestingly, as an aside, what kind of regime am I talking about? This technique was designed and codified to fight dictatorships in the name of just Western capitalist democracy replacing them. However, Gene Sharp, the theorist who put all this together, in many ways drew off of other prior revolutions, including nonviolent ones like South Africa, Indian independence, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement. But he also was getting the idea of parallel government itself from Crane Brinton, an American historian of revolutions, an American historian of France, who wrote Anatomy of Revolution. And Crane Brinton was getting these ideas. Actually, parallel government is really just a retranslation of dual power, which was Lenin's theory about the workers' councils in 1917. So this draws off what I would call the entire revolutionary tradition, whether democratic and or socialist. So Gene Sharp codified these things in a very clear way in order to fight dictatorships. And I think there are many dictatorships that do deserve to be overthrown. There's, a lot of tanky nonsense supporting like these authoritarian mixed economies and defending them from resistance. To hell with that. But also, there's the issue of what if we used this, supposedly CIA-sponsored, Western-backed method of crowd revolution, color revolution, to overthrow capitalism itself? Because that is how these theories started. It was the Russian Revolution that originally flipped the pillars. You could say the Russian Revolution was the first color revolution, and the color was red. The Russian Revolution was an early parallel government. So these theories that sort of got co-opted by liberalism, by the West, in many ways their roots are in the socialist tradition, but also in many other. There's a lot of global South democracy revolutions that don't go to socialism, but just overthrow some dictator, and then they have formal democracy and greater individual rights, and the people are getting slaughtered by the government less, and that's a big improvement. Which is why I really push back against a lot of socialists who think socialism is the only thing. I do ultimately support something called democratic socialism, because I've seen that democracy without socialism is capitalism, and that's not democracy. But socialism without democracy is just its own state-based class society based on the party as the ruling class. And then the proles continue being exploited, even if they enjoy certain benefits like a planned economy. So I don't think democracy is not material. Some people say, oh, we're materialists, focus on economics. But, your right to form alternative parties is a material reality. Your right to protest and speak without getting raided by the police is a material reality. The public, even though the institutions have more power to uphold a regime than does the public can still withdraw its quiescence through resistance and protest, and popular resistance often spreads contagiously to the state pillars, to the pillar of support institutions. Now, Gene Sharp's analysis divides society into a three-layer cake: the regime at the top, the public at the bottom, the pillars in the middle. So resistance at the bottom of the public turns the middle institutional pillars against the top of the system and the regime. So it's sort of like divide and conquer, except it's a popular divide and conquer working from the bottom up instead of a top-down divide and conquer. Something important to remember is reversals of fortune occur frequently. So if things are really bad, if you're in this system that's oppressing you and it seems invincible, it seems eternal, you can never overthrow it, it's been around hundreds of years, well, reversals of fortune occur frequently. Things change suddenly, often. Thus arises the question, to what exactly are the pillars defecting? To the crowd, to the revolution in the abstract? This can work initially, but to prevent the old regime from reoccupying the power vacuum, after being temporarily displaced, a new arrangement has to be reached. Without specific direction, crowd revolution tends to result in the default type of society, globally or regionally. This means in the prevailing model that crowd revolutions tend to knock down various corrupt officials and dictators, replacing them with just capitalist pseudo-democracy. In the Middle East, it might lead to a theocracy. The default setting won't work for us. Our only acceptable outcome is an upgrade, so we need a parallel government which specifies a higher politics, a more advanced politics. You get to listen to me write this as I go. Aren't you lucky? Anyway, so say you're an anarchist and you don't like the idea of starting a new government to replace the old one. You will still need some coordinating entity to fill the power vacuum. At minimum, a federation of workers is necessary to organize the economy, and counter-revolution attempts can't be defeated by spontaneous response alone. You can call it a mass assembly instead of a government, or make policy by Facebook poll, go wild, but you will still need something for economic coordination and security. Without a dual power institution capable of coordinating society as a whole, revolution always backslides to capitalism or some other repressive class structure. We must surpass the defensive struggle of anti-austerity for the offensive struggle of universal housing and healthcare in the U.S., as well as parallel government and regime change. Our problem is always having to reorient the struggle from defensive to offensive, repeatedly and endlessly. Defense is the default orientation we must continually work against. Something Gene Sharp says, that's the same thing as what Vladimir Lenin says, is you have to form an organization. Lenin may call it a party, Gene Sharp calls it a protest organization. In practice, they do the same thing. You may have to create training and instruction materials for anti-capitalist regime change which explain the specific vision or strategy of your group or coalition. Hopefully this book that I'm writing and a video I make out of it, like a documentary or movie, will serve as such a training. But in the meantime, what you could do is just introduce these ideas to people in a talk and then pair it with a movie about crowd revolution, like the Gene Sharp movie, How to Start a Revolution, and maybe pair it with, just some general anti-capitalist documentary or film, like a Michael Moore movie, or something about Marxism, the Intro to Marxism video. And through this, you begin training people to do more than just it be a discussion. Though it has to be a discussion at first for a while, probably. So in practice, steering the stormy energies of mass protest sufficiently to achieve regime change, instead of another big protest that disappointingly comes and goes, requires an intensely disciplined revolutionary organization. It's vital to remember that being a member of a revolutionary organization is intrinsically a bad experience because it's full of people experiencing the kinds of stresses which would drive them toward revolutionary organizing in the first place. After all, no one has a revolution because things are good enough already. They have them because they're having a bad experience. So thus, organizational discipline is justified on the basis that none of us want to participate in the first place, but are compelled by the necessity of our life realities. So we might as well buckle down and do what is effective instead of what is always fun. I'll probably articulate this later, but it's also pretty important to realize that these big waves of protest, they're often organized in advance. Like Black Lives Matter had a specific founding organization, a specific founding group of people. And then, it staged specific street actions, and then it grew to being a mass phenomenon. And so rather than intervene in other movements which are already underway, which tend to already have their sort of concept of what they're about, it makes more sense to build a revolutionary protest movement from scratch that is different from all the other mass protest movements and hashtag movements, different from them on the basis that it is focused on demanding a change of government as its primary main demand. It may start out small and abstract, but don't worry about it. Because, BLM started small, and you might have to use their model in a different way. One advance of BLM over, say, Occupy Wall Street was BLM was just based on meetings and actions. It wasn't based on being focused in like a specific geographic location of the encampment. So it allowed it to grow over time more effectively. More notes. You can assess the modern movement by infinite different criteria. You might be able to draw a map of which ones align with your preferred policy positions or preferred focus and movement work. At one level, all that matters, and at another level, it doesn't, because virtually every force within the movement is failing to seriously prepare socialist regime change. So yeah, if you're making a map of who could we work with on this, probably no one. But at another level, everyone. In a certain sense, then, it doesn't matter if you're a woke SJW or a class reductionist, or believe in base building or rioting or Trotskyism or Stalinism, because none of it is ever going to actually overthrow capitalism, because none of it is actually trying to. The critique is paradoxically complex in its simplicity. Quote, "Ask and you shall receive." That's from the Gospel, Matthew 7:7. It doesn't always work, but part of the problem really is as simple as people are only demanding reforms and not having protests specifically demanding a change of government. Would that be weird if they did? Maybe at first. Some small actions and photo op rallies preaching regime change or specifically condemning the U.S. government as illegitimate, which it is. Perhaps proposing a new system, perhaps even functioning as a rally for whatever parallel government you're building. If political candidates can have rallies, parallel governments are campaigning for office in a different way. In the film How to Start a Revolution, Gene Sharp explains, strategic nonviolent struggle is all about political power, how to seize political power, and how to deny it to others. This is very Machiavellian stuff we're talking about, despite being nonviolent. It's such a brutal way of phrasing it that it makes you wonder if Gene Sharp was a dictator in another life. Did he write From Dictatorship to Democracy as a penance for the sins of his past incarnations? Sergei Popovich, who helps lead the bulldozer revolution against Slobodan Milosevic in the year 2000, rephrases it in his book, Blueprint for a Revolution, as War Without Weapons, on page 182. So the modern reality is not countries united in one big crowd, but instead a situation of multi-crowd contention between competing crowds of opposing politics. This can be seen in the counterposing of the George Floyd and January 6 actions, as well as competing crowds over the election in Bolivia or in different regions of Ukraine. In Egypt, the crowd split over theocracy versus democracy. This is really important to keep in mind. Like, which one of these crowds represents the people? Maybe neither of them in some case, or maybe you can pick out a lesser evil or a lesser good between them, an imperfect good. Obviously, I would be more in support of George Floyd than January 6, but I would also say neither of them are going to win what people really need. So it's interesting that they both had mass participation. I think one had far more mass participation. But at a certain point, when you're fighting for the people, you have to have majoritarian intentions in fighting for the well-being of the people, but a minoritarian method of organizing with only a minority of the population. And this is difficult. You have to represent the people without necessarily embodying the people. Instead of thinking that the people will always be on your side, you just have to fight for what actually is materially the people's well-being without necessarily having the support of the majority of the people. And this is a question that has plagued revolutionaries forever. For example, in the American Revolution, the population was a three-way split between pro-revolution, anti, and indifferent. They did not actually have the people in terms of the majority on their side, even though I think it's obvious, at least to me, that what they did was of material benefit to the well-being of the people, and therefore represented the people despite not having the majority of the people's support. Okay, yeah, I did mention this. Our goal is to get at least one or multiple crowd movements to demand regime change in the name of redistribution and or democratic socialism. While it's certainly possible to politically intervene on a crowd, perhaps by attaining or seizing part of the speaking time during the rally to announce a parallel government and demanding regime change, perhaps even forming a parallel government out of the present crowd, that's been done, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I think once in Hungary there was a protest crowd where someone just declared that they would oppose the old government and form a new government, and they went to like a building where they started forming a legislature out of their own protest crowd. But of course, attempting this could get you told to leave if you do it at someone else's event. It could get you laughed at or just ignored. Crickets and silence and confusion from some people. Taking over crowds is worth attempting, but in practice, crowds can rarely be reoriented. They usually stick to the initial demand they were organized around and are rather hostile to any attempt to take the struggle further, seeing it as a criticism of their original limited direction. Therefore, you must construct your own brand new crowd from scratch. Crowds usually listen to you if you're one of the groups or individuals who built the initial, often small protests, which then developed into a mass crowd. The key then is initial small actions. It may feel absurd to start over from scratch with small actions when mass crowds are raging in the streets. Okay, so we've had things like George Floyd. We've had things like Occupy. We've had things like the Bernie campaign, mass participation. But to do something that is really necessary, we'll have to start over from square one. We'll have to go back. The problem is this. If those crowds aren't focused on regime change against capitalism, then they're the wrong crowds. It's edgy to say, oh, the Bernie crowd isn't good enough. Well, it's even edgier to say, like, the BLM crowd isn't good enough, right? And maybe these crowds, these are waves, and people from the past waves will participate in the next waves. I'm saying a new wave has to be started, and it has to be started intentionally and artificially. Like, we currently don't even have a mass disruption for universal healthcare, let alone socialist regime change. Like, during COVID, like, where were the mass protests for economic relief? Where were the mass protests for universal healthcare during COVID? Like, shouldn't that have actually been what the mass rioting was about? The problem is, in America, we only riot about race, where over in Europe, they riot about, oh, they're cutting welfare. They riot about wages. They riot about retirement. They riot to expand and defend their welfare state. In America, we don't do that because we have this very individualist, very identitarian idea of politics. Crowds are likely to resist being repurposed, even if you try to make it a dual purpose. No matter how big a group or movement is, it's totally useless if it's not doing the correct thing, especially since most mass movements simply won't change direction after forming. So anyone with a real knowledge of revolutionary history, modern and classical, or a real knowledge of economics would not dare say that revolution is a fantasy. America is a powder keg waiting to blow, the only issue being that No one yet knew how to light the fuse until the writing of this book. Cocky me. A parallel government can probably only take power on the basis of self-appointment, since the electoral system is corrupted and the media spreads false consciousness. If a parallel government is even necessary, it's because a country's electoral system is so biased, the majority so brainwashed, that electoral change is effectively blocked. Remember, the way to unbrainwash the majority is to start the revolution without the majority, in order to win over the majority by the material example of struggle, rather than the futility of mass persuasion in an environment where the ruling class has the advantage in communications, via owning the media. Individual persuasion can still work for organizing the struggling minority. A revolutionary government can't really be based on representing anyone, because all elections in capitalism happen under the condition of corporate media and party systems who turn Western democracy into a managed democracy, or guided democracy hopelessly rigged for capitalism. If the electoral system is so flawed, then no acceptable vote count can be taken to legitimize a parallel government. A parallel government can then take power and establish its legitimacy solely by the argument toward its own necessity for the material well-being of the people, despite there intrinsically being no way to legitimately elect a revolutionary government. The revolutionary government should always promise to set a limit on its own existence after it establishes an improved electoral system. A parallel government, or at least its parallel before it takes power, can seek the support of labor unions, but should also... Okay, just an aside, the reason I'm going into all this is okay, you form your parallel government, now what? How do you build a mass revolutionary movement to bring your parallel government into actual state power? That's the question, the implicit question I'm trying to answer. So you can seek the support of the labor unions, but you should also not claim to represent them in the sense of being formally endorsed by them. Union democracy suffers from the same limitations as general capitalist democracy, given that unions are generally bargaining units within capitalism, who can only reduce rather than abolish the theft of labor value known as exploitation built into all capitalist profit and enterprise. Union democracy is just as much of a managed democracy rigged in favor of capitalism as U.S. Congress, so the best you could do is get some union endorsements for progressive electoral candidates, not for a revolutionary government, until the situation is brought to a critical mass by forces outside the unions. In practice, most unions would only affiliate with such an effort after the masses were already in the streets, bringing the parallel government to power. Unions are some of the strongest forces to join revolutions, but are also sometimes the very last to join. In strategy games, they could be described as a victory fleet, a massive and powerful force, which takes forever to build, but is very likely to win once ready. The question always is, how do you survive or grow in the meantime before your victory fleet of revolutionary unions is built? That takes other more immediate approaches, like orienting towards self-organized activist civil disobedience made of individuals, rather than relying solely on unions. Therefore, we must form ourselves into socialist parallel governments and administrations which declare themselves not on the basis of representation but necessity for the people's material well-being. To be clear, in the U.S., this means forming a rival socialist government opposed to the current U.S. government or Congress, with the socialist parallel government declaring itself the rightful power, not on the basis of being elected, but self-appointment on the basis of promising wealth and power to the people, contending that this is justified and unavoidable because redistribution is necessary, capitalism is ending the world, and there are no fair elections under capitalism. Let us replace creative destruction with destructive creation, using institutions and movements who spell the end of the status quo merely by being formed. Parallel government is that exact institution, that exact movement. In practice, the strategy of Gene Sharp and of Leninism are more alike than people realize. Lenin's State and Revolution may have said smash the state, but actions speak louder than words, as what the Bolsheviks largely did was repurpose the old government agencies which had served both a monarchy and a capitalist provisional government into serving a socialist government. In the USA, the conflict over January 6 has already created a political conflict within the pillars, between liberals and conservatives. In the face of a revolutionary government with popular support or wide publicity, the staff of the pillars would naturally feel pulled in a new direction. Those who say the pillars cannot be flipped because their class interests align with the ruling class, or that the institutions of capitalism are too inflexible, overlook how oppressive the pillars of a dictatorship are, and yet even in such a repressive institution, the pillars are willing to flip. Even the Bolsheviks split the pillars, despite their slogan of smashing the state, incorporating old monarchist and capitalist army officers and bureaucrats into the socialist government. So I'm going to call it there. Hopefully you get what the heck I'm talking about now when I say, like, oh, we can overthrow the government just by forming a parallel government, and there doesn't have to be much bloodshed. We can just form a parallel government, and it'll all unfold like magic, and it'll all be this beautiful thing. Like, yeah, I do mean that, actually. But I hadn't yet in the podcast spelled out the mechanism by which that occurs. How the backfire effect of nonviolent protest being repressed builds support. How you're not trying some impossible fantasy destruction of the state by some kind of guerrilla revolutionary army. And it's not that such thoughts don't cross people's minds. It's just that if you actually study guerrilla warfare, you understand that in developed countries it's impossible simply because of the advanced development of the technology of the police and military forces in advanced developed countries. But guerrilla warfare has been replaced by this new method of crowd revolution, which you do have mass crowd protests across the world right now. They come and go in waves, but they keep growing in frequency and in participation. And these crowd revolutions often do cause a crisis of legitimacy for the government they protest. And they cause defections and mutiny and realignment frequently within the security forces, inspiring them to either refuse to carry out their repressive job role or to even realign themselves to the side of the revolution. And this is where I think hope lies. Now that we have this equation, we have parallel government plus multi-party socialism as what we're fighting for, plus the institution that will implement it. And then in order to install that institution into power, we have the two-sided coin of anti-government protests or protests demanding regime change or removal of government, combined with flipping the pillars of state, the pillars of support, causing the realignment or at least the disintegration of discipline of state agencies and security forces. And furthermore, this has happened again and again throughout history. This is not something I'm just inventing in my head. Now, what I would say is there are different components of it. I would say not all of these things have happened all together in the exact way I'm proposing. There have been many revolutions with parallel government. There have been many revolutions with anti-government protests. There have been many revolutions with the realignment of security forces and state agencies. I think the thing that really is missing is what I call multi-party socialism, and that initially happened in the Russian Revolution but disintegrated quickly for reasons I think were beyond the control of the Russians or the Bolsheviks. You do have social democracy in Europe, which could be sort of thought of as a socialist movement, which has never achieved socialism in Europe, but has achieved benefits for the people, and which coexists with multi-party pluralism. So between European social democracy and the tradition of communism, of like hardline Soviet-style socialism, I think you have all the different pieces of what I'm talking about. You have a planned economy. We've had Western plural democracy. So the issue really is the politics of combining this sort of Western-style plural democracy with a fully socialized, cooperativized, and nationalized economic system. Those are the two things that have not yet occurred in combination. But all the other pieces of this revolutionary strategy of parallel government, anti-government protests, and realigning the state pillars, those have all happened in separate revolutions and even in the same revolutions. So what I'm talking about is not impossible. All the ingredients of it already exist in abundance in human history, distant and recent. The key is really just putting together the best of both worlds of the East and its socialism and the West and its democracy. That's really the key. I believe the Enlightenment sort of suffered a split, and it started out pro-democracy, and then it was supposed to evolve with the Russian Revolution towards democratic socialist revolution. And then instead it became a global fratricidal Cold War between capitalist democracy and authoritarian socialism. And that's really the split that we need to heal. All this revolutionary strategy that's already been done globally in separate instances or in the same instances. All the ingredients are here. We just gotta put together this recipe, put all the ingredients in the pot, watch them simmer, stir them carefully, play with the heat, and make sure we're getting the right sort of curve of heat while we brew this stew of a multi-party socialist or democratic socialist crowd revolution using a parallel government, demand for a new government, demand for the removal of the old government, and realignment of the state agencies and security forces. Now, one last thing to be clear before I wrap up the episode is that sometimes the way that the state agencies get realigned is by force. Some of them may declare for the revolution early on, but from what I've heard, the Bolsheviks took over They established their new central government through the October insurrection. And then basically some of the state agencies came over voluntarily just because they saw who was in charge now. Some of them still resisted, and Red Guards had to be sent into the old monarchist and provisional government bureaucracies and ministries to basically force upon them new managers who would force the socialist political alignment and force the policies onto these resistant, obstructive bureaucracies. But, that's the thing you got to do, and I discussed that more in the old episode 7 of Managing the Old Regime. So, hopefully you see now that this isn't all some mad pipe dream, that this is well-established global revolutionary history, drawing from different traditions, democracy and socialism, and national liberation, but also trying to see them all as one tradition that has just been wrongfully fragmented into competing fragments, which will be reunified in order to liberate the species. That the liberation of the species depends upon reunifying these fragments which were wrongfully divided from each other. And that if we do achieve this, combining all these revolutionary traditions and refusing the democratic and the socialist tradition with these other revolutionary traditions, these revolutionary practices, which are themselves a sort of tradition, then that will be the beginning of the end of global class society. If we achieve this synthesis at the theoretical level, then the movement will happen, because theory must precede practice. And if we do this, then achieving this unification at the theoretical level will result in achieving the unification and liberation at the global human level. So that's a pretty positive vision. Artificial scarcity can just be gone. Climate change can be stopped. We can have it all. We can have the universal housing and healthcare and income and jobs. We can have all of it. We can have like a 20-hour workday. And we can do it all. We can just automate nonsense and live in a utopian Jetsons kind of society. We can do it. I hope that this strategic framework provides some assistance in it actually occurring. My sort of area of pessimism is that I think without the sort of theory that I'm grinding out here, basically I think my theory is irreplaceable and unique in human history. And sometimes in a sort of like Wachowskian way, there was a movie Jupiter Ascending where they found out like their capitalism was actually controlled by like alien colonization. That capitalism was a product of like aliens just like farming humanity for resources. And sometimes I wonder, like, is what we're doing, does it have larger implications beyond ourselves? If there's a democratic socialist revolution on planet Earth, will other alien species see it? And will our revolution spread to other planets, to other species, possibly to other dimensions? So maybe I'm just an isolated theorist who no one will ever listen to, or maybe I'm the unacknowledged leader of the multiversal revolution. Who knows? I mean, these are just things that I amuse myself with. But hopefully the strategy is something real and will have real effects on real movements here on planet Earth, especially in the United States. I will argue in another episode that the United States should go first, because we're the ones with the power, we're the ones with the influence. The world will change if we change. If we don't, the world won't. But anyway, thank you for listening to these high theory, rarefied rambles on my part. This is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 9. Signing off.